Welcome everyone to 5 years of Grom ownership. Let's get right into it. So for those of you that are unaware or just here for the Benelli TNT 135 videos, this is my 2015 Honda Grom, and I picked this up in July of 2016, 5 years ago this month. So before we get into the review of this, I kind of want to go into just a little bit of backstory as to how I came about getting the Grom, why I've kept it for so long, and why I love it so much. In 2016, I was working downtown in a heavily congested area where parking was kind of at a premium, and at that time the only street transportation that I had was my pickup truck, which was not exactly the easiest thing to maneuver, especially in a city. In addition to that, it was expensive. I mean, the parking in the building that I worked in 5 years ago was $250 to $300 a month. It was insane. I was not going to pay that. So I wanted to think about some cheaper alternatives. And so one of the things that I thought about originally was to get a scooter. So in about 2015, before I even thought about this or even knew what Groms were, I picked up a Honda Elite. So it was super cheap, at $400, and just kind of used that as like a trial period to see whether or not I liked it. Because at the time I had not really delved into street bikes. I did not have anything that was strictly street. The most that I did street-wise was just dual sport stuff, and that was basically just getting to and from different trails. The only bikes that I've really had to deal with at the time were dirt bikes. And so the scooter was great. I had it for a couple months and just to see whether or not I liked it, and turns out I did. It was a really great introduction to kind of street and city riding. It was low stakes, you know, it was only 50cc, so I was limited to 35-mile-an-hour roads, and it gave me that opportunity to kind of, on a lower level, introductory level, kind of understand how city riding works, what to look for in lane splitting, since that's legal in this state. And it gave me an overall confidence boost, thinking, okay, this is something I can do. When I finally got that thought that yes, this is something I want to do, I started thinking about, okay, what kind of bike, what kind of scooter I wanted to get. I was thinking I'll get a Zuma 125 or maybe a Honda Ruckus, something like that, something fun. And then a few days later, I was on the street just walking down, and I saw someone on a Grom like this ride by. Kind of did a double take and thinking, what was that? Was that something that he built? Is that something that's from a manufacturer? I had no idea. So I think that night, even I just Googled literally miniature sport bike or something to that effect, and then just kind of scrolled through the pages and looked at images until I finally saw what I was looking at and found the name Honda Grom. After that, I dove into YouTube videos, I dove into articles, kind of getting everyone's take on it and what the impressions were, what it was all about, how it was set up, all this stuff. And the more and more I've watched and the more I read, the more and more I knew I had to get this bike. So a few months after that, got rid of the scooter, ran around the local dealers, and then I picked this up brand new in July of 2016. So because this is a 5-year review, not a 1 or a 2-year review, this is going to be a bit more in-depth just over the things that I've done in the last year and kind of focusing on the longevity aspect of things. Now, I have written about this bike in past years before I was actually putting effort into YouTube videos, and so I did that in a couple of places. I maintained a build thread on hondagrom.net, a very popular Grom forum, and I also did regular or semi-regular blog posts about some of the things that I would do with this bike in a similar fashion on my website, lexdfox.com. So I'm going to link both of those, my build thread and my website, down below, so you can check out what I've done over the years in more detail. Another reason I'm not going into all the details here is because if I were to go front to back with the full modifications that I've done to this, it's going to be a whole video in itself. In fact, that's the next video. So I will go in depth and kind of go through every single piece that I've done to this, and I think will be really interesting to see is the total cost, because I do track every single dollar that goes into this bike. So we can kind of sum everything up, everything that I've done to it and what that amounts to over 5 years. But first things first, let's talk about what I've done to this bike in the last year. So over the last couple years, my modifications have actually shifted from adding new stuff to replacing stuff that I had put on in year 1 or year 2. So at the end of last year, one of the big things that I replaced was basically the whole control setup that I had done previously. So I have new bars, new levers, new grips. So in the last year, I mostly was kind of replacing OEM parts that have failed or things that I thought could fail pretty soon. So one of the big things was my stator was fried. It would not hold a charge anymore and was draining the battery, so that was replaced. I also went ahead and replaced the cam chain tensioner system, basically everything except for the chain, just to be preventative. And then I replaced the chain and the sprocket because those were getting worn out. But it wasn't all replacing. There was a few new things that I put on the bike. So for example, I did the shift support bracket from Hard Racing, and let's not forget the old Saddleman seat here for some extra comfort. So since this last year, I was either replacing failed OEM parts or potentially worn OEM parts. It kind of begs the question in terms of reliability in the long term, how much money would go into this in just replacing those parts? So let's talk cost for a second. So with 5 years of ownership, I can definitely speak to cost. And I think a big question here is, what is this bike? Is it a low budget bike or is it a money pit? And the short answer is yes. Let me clarify by saying the short answer depends, because one of the things with Honda Groms in particular is that they are so versatile. You can do pretty much anything with this bike. I've seen all sorts of builds. You can see track builds, stunt builds, drag builds, show bikes. The list goes on, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of aftermarket parts that are available for this bike. It's endless. So the sky's the limit, honestly. If you really want to, you can put some serious money into these bikes. And when you put money into these things, that can affect the reliability. It depends on how much you maintain it and how much modifications that you're doing to the original structure, the original engine. On one hand, you have a completely stock bike that you don't thrash and you maintain and take it out occasionally. That thing could probably last you a lifetime. On the other hand, you could have some $15,000, $20,000 drag bike, big bore kit, stretched out thrasher of a Grom that you ride really aggressively, and it could blow up in 2,000 miles. I've seen both cases. So this bike, build wise, is probably in the middle of those two categories. It's heavily modified, but not so much with the engine. My goal with this bike was to be a very reliable commuter that I can take 5 days a week to and from work, while at the same time have something that can handle the aggression of a canyon carving day. Something that feels really comfortable, really solid, planted on the road, that I can flick, into corners. And I feel like I've achieved that here. But if we kind of go back to the cost aspect of it, let's kind of talk OEM parts. So if we take out aftermarket parts here and just kind of look at a stock Honda Grom, over the years, how many parts are we going to expect to fail? Are there a lot of things that will fail over the years? Or is there pretty much nothing and it's something you can just set and forget and just ride? So let's talk about some of the OEM failures that I've had to deal with over the lifetime of this bike. So as much regular maintenance as you can do with these bikes, things still do go wrong, and the Grom's no different. What I did was I looked at the parts list of my bike and kind of pulled out all the OEM parts that I had to replace over the years to see kind of what the genuine failures were that I have experienced. So the first one was actually in my first few months of ownership, when I would find when I was in 4th gear, really high speed, when I would let off the throttle, I get this really bad grinding noise, and it wouldn't go away until I pulled my clutch in, and then it would disappear. And it turned out it was a fried clutch collar behind the clutch basket. It wasn't spinning freely, and so I replaced that along with a couple of washers and a bearing, everything basically that went behind the clutch basket. But all told, it was $11. So the next incident, while not necessarily a failure on Honda's part, but an OEM part nonetheless, my bike was run over in a parking lot in 2018, and as a result of that, the front axle was completely bent, so I had to replace it. The good news was it was only $5. Then about a year later, the battery died on me. I didn't replace that with an OEM battery. I got a better lithium-ion battery, but I spent about the same as you would, $100. So then some of the more important replacements that I've had to do in 2020 came about. The stator that I mentioned earlier. So I was finding that the battery wouldn't hold a charge and it would just constantly die on me. Turns out the stator was fried. Replaced that for $40. And finally, towards the later of 2020, while not necessarily something I had to do right away, I read from other forum members on hondagrom.net that there was some premature failure of the cam chain tensioner system where the rubber was starting to eat up and people would find chunks of rubber in the oil when they were doing the oil changes. So as a preventative measure, I decided to go ahead and just replace everything to do with that except the chain. So cam chain tensioner arms, buttons, spring, rollers, everything. And when I pulled it out, it was actually just fine, but all told, it was another 40 bucks, so not bad. So if we add up all of these OEM failures, that comes to $196 over 5 years. Not bad. But what about regular maintenance? Let's talk annual running costs. So let's kind of talk about some of the annual maintenance that I've done with this over the years. And I think that really boils down to 3 things. And that's going to be changing the oil, checking the valves, and cleaning the chain. Pretty simple stuff. So when it comes to oil changes, I do mine every 1,500 to 2,000 miles, and I do about 3,000 to 3,500 miles a year, so about 2 oil changes. And an oil change is about 15 bucks, honestly. It's a quart of oil and either a gasket for the oil spinner or a new filter, in my case with an oil spinner delete. So checking the valves, it's not necessarily an annual thing. It doesn't honestly have to be done that frequently, but it's super easy to work on these things and really easy to check the valves, so I do it pretty regularly. And as far as cost goes, it's basically free as long as you have basic hand tools. You can get one of the valve adjustment tools that are specific to it. Motion Pro sells one for about 20 bucks, and if you're going to do it regularly, I highly recommend it. One-time cost, super cheap. And then when it comes to cleaning the chain, I mean, that's super easy. All you really need is just some chain lube, which is like 5 bucks a can, and that can last you who knows how long. So all told, this bike really pretty much for regular maintenance costs about 175 bucks total. So that's about 35 bucks a year. Not bad. But let's not forget some of the long-term maintenance items here. Now, I might be missing out on some of the more minor ones, but the big 3 that come to mind are chain, sprocket, and tires. So over my 5 years, I'm on about the 3rd set of each of these. So for tires, each one costs about 65 bucks. I get the Michelin Power Pures. And with install, my last bill came out to about $200. And chain and sprocket sets are actually pretty cheap on these bikes because the chains are so small. If you want to get just some direct OEM replacements, you can easily find those for under 50 bucks. If you want to get something a little bit more quality or beefier, like a 428 conversion like I have here, you're looking at something more like 80 bucks. So again, as I said, I might have missed a couple of small things, but if you add all those up and average it over a 5-year period, you're looking at about 150 bucks a year. So all told, this thing costs about 225 bucks a year to maintain. So I'd say that's pretty low cost to me. I know I said I'd talk costs in the next video with the total cost of the bike, so consider this a preview, I guess. But, you know, this is a 5-year review. It's a long-term ownership. And with long-term ownership, that's the kind of thing you start to think of when you have in your mind, you know, when you want to continue to own this bike and continue to maintain it. But let's kind of focus on some of the other questions now, what people who might be looking into getting a Grom ask. For example, would I recommend this bike to someone? Of course I do! I wouldn't have held on to this thing for 5 years just for kicks. Is this a good bike for a beginner? This is a perfect bike for beginners. It's a perfect bike for experienced riders, for short riders, tall riders, any kind of rider. Except freeway riders. So if I did this all over again, would I change anything? Hell no! Although admittedly there are a couple of things I wish I'd done sooner. 2 things that really come to mind are the suspension and the seat. But I really like the path that I took with this bike, and all things considered, I would not change a thing. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, 5 years of Grom ownership. I said it once and I'll say it again, this is my favorite bike. I have no intention of getting rid of it, so I would not be surprised if in 5 years' time we have a 10-year review coming out. Again, if you want more information on some of the modifications that I've done or want to see my build thread, check the links down below. I also want to give a special shout out to someone on Instagram, Digitus_art. He's the one that did the thumbnail image here and basically took a picture of the Grom and made it a pop art illustration, and it looks fantastic. It's really cool. I'm really happy with his work, and if you want to do something similar for your bike or your car even, he can do that. So hit him up, Digitus_art on Instagram. So we'll see you next week when we go more in depth on the modification of this bike. We're going to go front to back, everything that I've done, plus the cost that was associated with it. How much does this bike cost sitting here today? Thanks for taking a look, and see you next time.